Hey everyone, welcome. As a paleoecologist, I literally spend my entire life looking deep into the past. And today, we're going on a bit of a scientific detective journey. In this explainer, we're diving into a massive puzzle: how the extreme climate shifts of the last ice age completely hardwired the genetic diversity of modern humanity. If you've ever found yourself wondering why human populations across the globe have such distinct genetic signatures, well, the answer isn't just floating around in our DNA. It's actually carved right into the ancient landscapes our ancestors had to survive.
So think about this for a second. Did you know your DNA encodes a literal map of the Ice Age? It's wild, right? We so often think of our genetic makeup as just, a standard family tree, but it's actually a geographic map of ancient survival strategies. The incredibly diverse genetic structure we see in humans today is a direct result of exactly where our ancestors were forced to hunker down when the entire planet froze over.
All right, Section 1, the Ice Age genetic riddle. To really wrap our heads around our genes, we have to transport ourselves way back. I'm talking 20,000 years back, to the Last Glacial Maximum. Just imagine a world completely dominated by expanding glaciers and plunging temperatures. In early humans, they faced this deep freeze without any advanced technology. No engineered shelters, absolutely zero artificial heating systems, and definitely no puffy winter jackets to throw on. Because they couldn't just artificially adapt their surroundings to beat the cold, they were totally and completely dependent on natural biomes. They were desperately forced to seek out very specific, habitable ecological niches just to stay alive. Basically, Mother Nature entirely dictated their zip code. Section 2. Why exactly savannas? So, when the world basically turned into a giant freezer, where did early humans actually find sanctuary? You might intuitively guess they hid in dense forests to escape the cold, right? Well, actually, scratch that. Dense forests acted more like population sinks. They were incredibly difficult to navigate, and for hunter-gatherers, food just wasn't easily accessible. Instead, savannas and dry woodlands were the ultimate source habitats. Grasslands offered highly accessible plant and animal food, the wide-open spaces were absolutely perfect for hunting large game, and those isolated, scattered trees, they provided the essential materials for tools, fire, and crucial protection from predators. Now, what's really fascinating here is how the physical evidence perfectly backs up our ecological theory. The data points you see clustered so tightly together represent actual radiometrically dated Paleolithic human settlements. And notice how neatly they pack into those specific red zones. Those zones highlight the savanna and dry woodland biomes during the last glacial maximum. Humans weren't just randomly wandering around a frozen wasteland. They were highly restricted to these specific, life-saving ecological support systems. Moving right along to Section 3, river networks and settlements. Okay, so savannas alone weren't quite enough during the incredibly arid ice age, and this is where hydrology really saves the day. Rainfall would accumulate up in the highland areas, which then fed into perennial rivers. Think of these rivers as the planet's circulatory system, carving their way right through those arid, desert-like zones. As they flowed, they created these vital corridors of life, basically forming ribbons of oasis straight through uninhabitable wastelands. These river networks were the ultimate highways and grocery stores for early human populations. Without them, settling and thriving just wouldn't have been possible. Section 4. Climate isolation and DNA. Now let's pivot and look at how this stark physical reality totally shaped our biology. To get this, we need to define a really critical scientific concept, the glacial refugium. You can just think of a refugium as a genetic lifeboat. When the glaciers expanded and the deserts grew, habitable land shrank dramatically. Humans were pushed into these tiny, surviving pockets of savanna. They were essentially stranded on isolated biological islands, completely surrounded by a massive ocean of ice and barren desert. Because our ancestors were trapped on these lifeboats for thousands of years, the genetic island effect kicked into high gear. This strict geographic isolation completely stopped different groups from intermingling and sharing genes. Over millennia of being locked in these specific pockets, natural mutations started to accumulate. This process, known as genetic drift, led directly to the birth of unique Y-DNA haplogroups. You can think of these simply as distinct ancient family branches, like lineages R, Q, J, and T. The severe climate literally forced their DNA down totally different evolutionary paths. And this brilliantly illustrates that exact genetic split. We can see modern genetic diversity mapped out alongside the geographic origins of those specific ancient family branches. Just look at lineages R and Q evolving way out there in Central Asia, while lineages J and T were emerging near the Zagros Mountains. These massive genetic divergences absolutely didn't happen by chance. They happened because these populations were completely physically cut off from one another by impenetrable walls of ice and desert. Section 5. Warming and Population Expansion. So, eventually, the Ice Age comes to an end. As we move forward into the Holocene epoch, the planet's thermostat begins to rise, global temperatures increase, and those massive glaciers finally retreat. This triggers an incredibly dynamic post-glacial phase. Those isolated human populations could finally disembark from their lifeboats. They migrated outward, tracking the expanding grasslands and all the newly available food sources across these rapidly changing continents.
And as they dispersed, they took those incredibly unique genetic signatures they had developed in pure isolation and spread them all across the globe. So the crucial takeaway here is this. From an evolutionary standpoint, the post-glacial period is really just a blink of an eye. There simply hasn't been enough time since the end of the Ice Age for human migrations to mix and completely erase the deep genetic boundaries forged during those long millennia of isolation.
All right, Section 6, Exam Review, Key Facts. Let's make sure we've got this locked in. Let's rapidly walk through this undeniable chain reaction. First up, a total lack of advanced technology meant early humans relied 100% on their biomes. Second, glacial expansion forced desperate retreat, specifically into savanna refugia. Third, that prolonged geographic isolation caused genetic drift, permanently diverging our DNA into very distinct family lineages. And finally, climate warming allowed those distinct populations to disperse globally. It's a straight line. Climate dictated location, location forced isolation, and isolation shaped our very DNA. So we've seen how dramatically shifting biomes wrote the fundamental code of our genetic past. But the Earth's climate is shifting once again, and perhaps faster than ever before. As habitats change and populations either adapt or move in our modern era, it leaves us with a pretty profound question. How might current climate change reshape the future genetics of humanity? What is our genetic map going to look like 20,000 years from today? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, diving into our ancient past. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.